9. Before the heroine's brothers become birds in our two stories, they were adolescents. In the context of feminine psychology, a boy represents the honest enterprise and an impulse toward active life, also straightforward, naive ideas. Through the activity of the witch, the negative mother, this part of the young woman has been reduced to swans and ravens, that is, to otherworldly or melancholy fantasies. They need a starflower garment in order to return to the human realm. They could also be contents of a more spiritual nature, emotional, unconscious thoughts which need to be expressed in a humanly adequate manner. It is generally both, for emotion usually also contains a symbolic idea, and vice versa. A thought which comes from the unconscious generally contains a tremendous amount of emotion. The material for the shirts is made from star flowers. In the woods there grows, on a leafless stem, a very simple little star-like flower called a starrbloom, a starflower. I do not know the botanical name. Such flowers are usually to be found in the moss, under a tree where the sun shines. They are something like anemones, but rather more green, and suggest a star fallen into the green moss of the woods, a star growing from below instead of falling from above. The motif of the star coming from below is archetypal, and was of great importance in alchemical thinking. Paracelsus, the Swiss doctor and great alchemist, and one of his pupils, Gerard Dorm, whom Jung frequently quotes in his works on alchemy, expressed the idea that stars and herbs correspond astrologically. This thought has its origin in the Aristotelian Arabic tradition of the Middle Ages, namely that every flower or herb has an astrological correspondent and is the earthly image of an astrological constellation. There is the whole concept of the signatura rerum behind it. In connection with this, Dorn evolved an alchemical piece of active imagination, obtained not by painting or writing, but by mixing substances. He says that at a certain stage of the work, it is essential to shape the heavens below. For this, he recommends taking the dredges of old wine, the tartar, the deposit or the hard crust formed on the side of the cask, and distilling it until it obtains a liquid of blue color. Then the heavens below will have been prepared. Into this, certain stars must be introduced, which is done by putting in yellow flowers, the sherry and others, and thus the heavens below are established. This must be cooked, and the result represents the last stage in making the philosopher's stone, namely the ultimate union with the whole cosmic nature. When the heavens below have been produced, the alchemist is united with the unus mundus, cosmic divine nature. The idea, as far as we can understand at Dorn, is the following. Before God created the world, he conceived in it his mind. A plan exists in the architect's mind before building, so God, as a good architect, conceived a mental image of the world and of everything in it, from which later developed the multiple realizations in matter. This sum of detailed models, all still one in the mind of God, is identified in scholastic teaching with the feminine archetypal figure of the wisdom of God, and was called the sum of the tipi, or archetypal ideas. Dorn calls this potential divine world the unus mundus, the one cosmos that is still an undivided whole. By unus mundus is expressed the idea that a multiplicity of objects only comes into existence by the realization of this plan. Before this model plan of the world was materialized, there were no single objects. They were like germs united in a liquid or something similar, rather than an immense sum of material objects, as the material world really is. The oneness of the Godhead in matter was thus expressed. This one world that is hidden behind our real world is the dimension with which the alchemist unites himself and becomes one, but not in a pantheistic form. Pantheism is the idea of becoming one with the actual physical world, but Dorn's idea is to unite with what is behind, the germ of oneness behind the multiplicity of actual existence. The Chinese Taoist philosophy contains a similar idea. The enlightened man, the Taoist master, becomes one with the Tao. He lives with the germs of reality, but not reality itself. In the I Ching, hexagram 16 says in the second place, firm as a rock, the philosopher's stone, the wise man, the superior man, knows the germs and acts at once. By knowing the germs, the I Ching means, for instance, the following facts. Let us assume that there is something like archetypal evil in the air. Later it realizes itself by becoming an evil deed or somebody's thought. Now it exists, and you cannot turn the wheel back as you could have done in its germ-like state. When it was unconsciously constellated but not yet realized, something could have been done about it. At that stage, you can do something about fate. If you understand and can realize what is going on, the wise man, therefore, knows the germs and is capable of realizing what is going on behind the screen and can act upon these things and give them a better turn or a creative expression. He is in connection with the world behind the world and recognizes the germs and acts at once. There is the same idea in the alchemist becoming one with the unus mundus, with the totality of the archetypal constellations behind reality. He knows and is in immediate connection with them, and that is the source of his creativity, and also gives him some possibility of having a creative influence on what is going on. That is becoming one with the unus mundus, as Dorn conceived it. Behind his strange idea of establishing the heavens below and becoming one with them. The stars, as we know, symbolize archetypal constellations, the same thing as what the Taoist philosophy calls the germs, the thing which is not yet anything, which could mean a lot of different things, but is also not yet something definite. The word constellation comes from stella, star. It is a very vague concept because when we experience some exciting news, we say, now the problem has become constellated, and then feel that we have said something. We have a hunch of what we mean by that, but really we know absolutely nothing of what we mean, only that an aspect of the unconscious has been stirred. It comes up in the form of synchronistic events on the outside. Suppose a patient has an unusual dream of being threatened by, say, the waves of the sea, or a lion, but on the outside only complains about the boringness of life and having a headache. You can say that the unconscious has announced an archetypal emotional constellation, an X, but one could not yet say that it has been constellated on the outside. You make a mental note, and the analysis goes on for 3/4 of a year, but all the time you have the feeling that that tremendous drive, the libido of the lion, has not yet been constellated in outer life. Then one day a charming man turns up and asks the woman to go out and have an aperitif with him. The husband makes no objection and they have a very nice time. The headache gets better. The husband dreams about a traffic accident. She dreams of burglars, and now the thing is constellated. One always knew she was looking out the window for an adventure. Something wanted to create heat, a conflict and adventure and life. I would say that the problem of the lion, or of the waves of the sea, hitherto latent, becomes constellated. To understand the dream 6 months beforehand would be to know the germs. A bit of the biography of the woman now constellated. When she had the dream, it was ahead of her and far away. But when the earthquake comes, it is actually constellated. That is how we usually use the word. There is already a certain order in such a constellation. An archetype implies order, an arrangement. There is a pattern, and you see what the thing is driving at, more or less. As you know, the symbolism of the lion has an infinite multiplicity of meanings and can take different forms. After 3 months it might be the just so story of a love affair, or a divorce, or a psychotic upset, or a suicidal attempt, or a tremendous outbreak of emotion and its suffering. and the enlargement of consciousness. You cannot predict which. The one thing you may be sure of is that life will not go on smoothly for the next 10 years. Historically, the word constellation comes from astrology. As Jung says, astrology is a medieval scientific attempt to describe synchronicity with the help of, or by watching, synchronistic events in the sky. The star map is a beautiful mixture of order and disorder. There are regular and irregular events, like meteors. Behind the word constellation, there is a whole mystery. One knows, more or less, what one means by it, but it points to a mystery. To make a shirt with star flowers would mean something paradoxical. She sews the shirts with the purpose of redeeming birds from their animal shape, giving them a human way of expression. But she uses an archetypal constellation, a star, which seems most inhuman. The shirts are a paradox. By the use of an archetypal constellation, you help these contents to be humanely expressed. But consider what we do when we interpret a dream or a myth properly. We amplify the material with other archetypal motifs. We use archetypal motifs as a garment for the dream by which its content can be integrated. That is how we interpret unconscious material, and we only learn mythology in order to have enough knowledge of archetypal constellations with which to sew shirts for our own and our patients' unconscious contents. Flowers, in general, also have to do with feeling. We use them to express feeling, for instance, at births, marriages, funerals, and so on. That the rose symbolizes love, eros, is well known. Instead of using up the stars from heaven, the girl could have done something with stones, or she could have used flowers. That she used star flowers points to the feminine need of a feeling realization of archetypal constellations. For in a woman, realization takes place via feeling. Enlightenment usually comes to her in that realm. She makes the shirts while sitting in a tree, a refuge probably from wild animals. One would still take refuge there in an African jungle, where it is advisable to fasten yourself in a tree for the night. Our cousins, the apes, spend the nights in trees for the sake of safety. So trees have the basic idea of being above the ground and relatively safe for most types of snakes and other dangerous animals. In comparative religion, the tree and the climbing of a tree often has a meaning of approaching heaven, like going to the top of a mountain to converse with the gods and the ghosts who are supposed to be in the sky. Mircea Eliade describes in his book Shamanism how the Siberian shaman at the time of initiation climbs a birch tree and there speaks with the spirits. In an ecstatic state, the novices make a connection with the other world and come down as initiated and enlightened people. The shaman instructor climbs a higher birch tree and the initiate a lower one nearby, and a rope is stretched from one tree to the other, down which the instructor sends all the objects the new initiate will require for his duties, the drum, the girdle, etc., down along the rope. The heavenly powers give the initiate what he will need afterward in his work as a shaman. Only the shaman and such people are connected with the other world, and the magical connection is made via the rope, which the new shaman gets when sitting in a tree during his initiation. When he comes down from the tree, there is a great celebration. He was in a state of ecstasy and in connection with the other world, which means being in connection with and tied to one's own process of individuation and inner psychological growth. I have heard a story which shows how the archetypal symbol of the tree can still break through. A boy in the United States, at the age of about 16 or 17, got into a state of very near schizophrenia. His parents were frightened that he might become insane and sent him to an uncle, a farmer in the Midwest, hoping that hard work might help. The boy arrived, but instead of doing the hard work, climbed a tree, where he made a nest and took up a lot of food. The farmer, instead of calling a psychiatrist or insisting on the hard work, said, "To hell with him. If he wants to sit in a tree, let him." And he left him alone, and nobody bothered him except to give him food. He remained in the tree for 3 weeks or a month, just sitting in his nest, and then came down completely reasonable. The upset was over and he was okay. That was a narrow and lucky escape. The boy saved himself by following the archetypal impulse and had the luck not to be prevented by his friends. You could say he went through a shamanic initiation. He probably had visions from the collective unconscious in the tree. It was probably quite a remarkable experience. Had he been prevented, he might have had to be hospitalized. So this archetype is still very much alive, as evidenced by this story of a boy who had just enough instinct to cure himself and to keep himself from madness. Sitting in a tree, therefore, means retreat from reality and retiring into the realm of the spirits. It is as though, instead of avoiding the thing which threatened, one retired into it. The danger is a complete loss of connection with reality, and the advantage is that the threatening unconscious becomes a second womb, out of which rebirth can take place. The tree has therefore also a maternal quality, something from which one can fall like a fruit. It represents a process of spiritual rebirth. In many countries, there is a superstition that children come from trees. Climbing up a tree and climbing down again is a process of psychological rebirth. So people in a difficult situation sometimes live in a tree for a while, or normal children build a nest and play at living in a tree. It is the fantasy and magical world. In the United States, one says, go climb a tree to someone in a bad temper, or you can drive someone up a tree or up the pole away from human contact. During the time the heroine of the fairy tale is up the tree, she must not speak or laugh, which is often the rule during a state of incubation. In primitive incubation rites, boys are often shut up in a hut or in the sweat lodge and have to be silent. The word mysticism and mystic come from mio, keeping one's mouth shut. To put one's finger over one's mouth implies a secret about which one should keep silent. So mystical silence is the conscious variation of something that is less positive when it happens to one unconsciously. When an overwhelming and emotionally latent content of the unconscious constellates, it makes the human being dumb. It cannot be expressed. You probably know of states of emotion in which you cannot speak. If an analyzan touches an emotional complex and cannot speak anymore, that is not due to a lack of goodwill, for it cannot be talked about. So that possibly the most essential things do not come out for 5 or 6 years. The analyzan gets near the content but cannot talk. The emotion becomes too great. The catatonic state is the extreme expression of such a condition. On the other hand, when one decides not to talk about something in order to keep it inside and allow it to grow, neither spoiled nor contaminated by the vulgar thoughts of collective consciousness, then silence becomes the quality of consciously and silently covering up a mystery, in order that it may become a religious experience. Silence protects the content of the unconscious against collective misunderstanding externally and in oneself as well. We all have the banal interpretation in us, the nothing but reaction, by which we can harm important inner contents. Everyone who has done creative work knows that in statu nascendi, the creative idea should not be talked about. A writer should not show or discuss what he is writing with too many people. He usually knows when the work is in the delicate state of growth. Someone may say, yes, very good. But just that little hesitation after the yes can rob him of his courage to go on. It is as delicate as that before it is finished. A hesitation in the response or a silly question may lame him. One may criticize it oneself once the child has been born and there is a certain distance, but when it is half formed, one cannot talk about it. While in this state of silence, the heroine is discovered by the king, who takes her home and marries her. But even when she has children, she remains silent. Though she becomes the queen and goes back into human life, she yet goes on working on the redemption of her brothers, and in keeping to that process in silence, she really leads a double life. She is the queen, but secretly has this second occupation, about which nobody knows. and this double life involves her in misunderstandings and misinterpretations. The wicked mother-in-law takes her children away and accuses her of having murdered them. This motif often comes up in the legends since the middle of the 13th century. It is archetypal and is built into many fairy tale variations, and appears in many different countries and stories, so it must be very essential and typical. However, it is not a situation produced by one cause or constellation only. It can be brought about through the negative mother or the negative father complex. It can have different archetypal reasons, though the solution is very similar. The double life problem of the queen is, in one way, connected with the king, the dominant of collective consciousness, for he listens to his wicked mother, who persecutes the new queen. Although the latter is productive and has filled her normal feminine life, yet there is something going on behind the screen, a second process, which leads to misunderstandings. Sometimes the stepmother or the mother-in-law can alienate the king from his wife. Then she is slowly driven into complete isolation, and her heroic deed consists in keeping silent. The pressure in the situation does not succeed in forcing her to disclose her secret, in spite of the threat to her life. She endures the misunderstandings of those around her, and her highest endeavor is applied to keeping the religious secret. Her plight could be likened to that of Job, who, at the time of his deepest depression and difficulty, was surrounded by loving friends with their collective misinterpretations. In such a situation nowadays, people tell you that you are clinging to a neurotic idea. To you, it is religious loyalty to God. That is what it feels like inwardly. But since others talk like that, perhaps it is just an anonymous idea or possession, for there is something in you that puts the same question. To have that innermost instinctive assuredness that tells you what is extremely difficult when one is torn by doubts and really does not know whether one's animus or one's real nature is speaking. For example, a woman may love a man who disappoints her in some matter of relationship, and something within her says that she is a damn fool and that it is not a proper relationship for her. But another voice tells her that that is her animus, and that she should hold on, even though the situation looks bad. Then again, a voice says that she is tying herself to the wrong problem. Generally, a woman's individuation process has to pass through such phases. And who can say what is the right thing? Dreams may be a great help, but even they are not always clear. So one may be left alone, like Job, sitting among the ashes and covered with boils. But this is the moment in which a human being can discover his immediate and personal connection with the Godhead. Keeping the discussion within and not allowing disruptive forces to bring it into the open is one of the ultimate vital battles in the process of individuation. Here it goes so far that the woman is condemned to be burned at the stake as a witch, but even so she remains loyal to her inner task. The solution comes in the classical way, by chance, or as we would prefer to say, synchronistically. The 6 years are over, and the swans come and she throws the shirts over them, redeems them, and is liberated from the stake. But one sleeve she had not finished, and the youngest brother has a swan's wing instead of his left arm. One could say with Gotter, in Sir Theodore Martin's translation, "Alas, still with earthly taint is he encumbered." Though here one could also say, "Something of the heaven remains with us, awkward to carry." In India, the Atman, the divine spirit, especially in the form which rather keeps out of creation, in contrast to Brahman, though they are the same, is often symbolized by the swan and is said to be like a swan hovering over the sea with one leg in and one leg out of the water. If he should pull out the second leg, the world would cease to exist. Maya, the illusion of the world, goes on because Atman does not pull out his second leg. In the fairy tale, you could say that 3/4 or 5/6 of the Atman is in the world, but one wing is in the other. Had the left wing been finished and become an arm, there would be no problems, no questions left over. It is like a religious and spiritual question mark, which can never be integrated and perhaps should not be. for then everything would be too clear and too settled. One would know all about it, and that would be death. When interpreting unconscious material, one has a kind of conscience about it. If one interprets it too superficially, one feels that one has not got to the depth or essence. But if one interprets it thoroughly, one comes to the point where it seems enough, though the fullest explanation has still not been given. The archetypal basis must remain a mystery, which the best interpretation cannot solve. It has its wing in the other world and can never be quite pulled over into this one. The Catholic teaching is that every dogma has a clear, comprehensible part which the Church Fathers can discuss, but that there is also a mystery about which one can never be enlightened. It is that spiritual question mark which remains, even if a satisfactory and full attempt has been made to bring into consciousness the secret content of the symbol. If, in a banal way, we take the swans as the words animus, it would mean that the animus always also contains the element of being a mystery, something inexplicable, which is the secret of both its beauty and its awkwardness. This last boy is a cripple, with a silly swan's wing and only one hand with which to act. It is something unsettled which belongs to the element of being human. The brothers and sister kiss each other. The persecution by the mother-in-law is shown up, and she is burned as a witch. She is the evil manifestation of the negative mother, the toad at the bottom of the well, which is now removed, and the others, the 6 brothers and the king and queen, live together and make 8, the symbol of totality. In the story of the ravens, there are several differences, for instead of climbing a tree, the girl goes on a long journey. She goes to the sun and moon and stars, and gets help from the morning star. This is a variation of the archetypal motif called the heavenly journey. It is also to be found with the shamans and in antiquity, as well as in the book of Enoch in the Jewish tradition. Initiation takes place through a long journey and the final return to earth when one is a prophet and a shaman, knowing about the things of the other world. The alchemists tell of their alchemical journey when an angel took them to the firmament and star powers initiated them into the knowledge of alchemy. In fairy tales on feminine psychology, when the heroine makes the quest by such a heavenly journey, there is very often a reversal of values, in which the sun is the most evil power, the moon rather evil, and the night with its teeming stars beneficial, in contrast to the usual interpretation by which the sun is the source of enlightenment and the night the darkening power to be avoided. This motif is to be found in most mystery journeys concerned with the problem of eros, of love, whereas when it is a question of going into the beyond to find spiritual and mental illumination, the sun is of the highest value. In the Persian Mithraic mysteries, for instance, in the time of Christ, the novice goes through the stages of the raven, the lion, the sunrunner, and the father before becoming one with the sun god. The sun, for a man, is a symbol of the godhead of the self, the goal of initiation and the most positive symbol of the mystery. But here and in so many other initiations, there is the same thing reversed, even down to the symbolism of Mozart's magical fruit, where the prince says to his bride, "Do not trust too much the sun or the moon. Come down with me into the darkness of the night." The darkness is the goal, and the sun is a destructive, burning power. You remember the motif we discussed briefly in The Girl Without Hands, in which the king had to put the napkin over his face. There we saw that consciousness is destructive to certain processes in the psyche. The most beneficent power for the girl on this journey is the morning star, that is, Venus, the principle of love and all its symbolism. Venus, the principle of eros par excellence, helps her. There are problems which cannot be solved by pulling them into consciousness, but only by following one's own feeling, and that is very often essential in a woman's process of individuation. Venus gives the girl the crooked bone with which to unlock the glass castle where the 7 ravens are imprisoned. This is an important symbol. It is the wishbone in the chicken with which, as with the double cherries, the one who gets the bigger end has his wish, which must not be disclosed. There are all sorts of superstition connected with the crooked bone, and one common to the whole of Europe is its use in love charms. In the Middle Ages, a frog's leg was put in an anthill, and when the ants had eaten away all the flesh, it was used for love charms. With the crooked bone, a love charm could be made. Probably the crooked bone that Venus gives the girl has some similar meaning. We might ask ourselves, what has a crooked bone to do with a love charm? It probably has to do with hooking. That is an old association, but we also speak of a hook for projection. It's probably the archetypal fantasy that you need such crooked bones in the hope that your positive projection will not fall off, but will hold on to the other. The girl puts the crooked bone given her by Venus in her handkerchief and loses it. And then, after a little hesitation, she cuts off her little finger and uses that as a key for the glass castle. The cutting off of the little finger suggests a painful sacrifice, giving a bit of one's own flesh. The sacrifice would have been too easy if Venus's crooked bone had been used. Seemingly, love magic alone no longer works. A woman has to suffer and contribute to the problem if she wants to develop and redeem her own personality. We can also say that we can use all our fingers as hooks in order to grab something, and if we cut off one, we lose a hook. It is a sacrifice of ego consciousness. A woman in love involuntarily has also intrigue or plot. I want, I wish, he must, etc. There's always the intrigue and the plot, beginning with walking past the place where one hopes to meet him, and then looking surprised, though in the morning it had all been planned. That is hooking with the ego. Cutting off the figure would mean cutting off the egotistical planning and plotting, and the intentional attempts at hooking in. There's always the crucial problem as to whether or not the fulfillment of love is meant by the self. If not, then it must be sacrificed. In chiromancy, each finger is attributed to a planet, and Mercury rules over the little finger. So its sacrifice would be the cutting off of mercurial planning or plotting, the ego use of it, using the cleverness of the witch for ego purposes. The woman thinks she hooks the beloved, but she gets herself. She becomes the victim of her planning and so loses her freedom, from which arise the innumerable tragic cases one so often comes up against. A woman sometimes comes into analysis with an ego purpose. She is interested in a particular man, whom she has tried unsuccessfully to hook. She was too neurotic, but the devil says that if she were all right herself, then she could do it. So she comes up with a clever mercurial plan so that she may be able to hook more efficiently. And if the plan fails, she walks out of analysis and throws the whole thing over, and thus confesses that her ego plot has failed. That is one of the various dangerous corners of feminine psychology in the process of individuation. We need to sever the little finger, to sacrifice the ego plans, and hand the whole thing over to the self. To love someone is quite legitimate, but one should add Deo concedente, God willing. Similarly, when a man begins to work with the unconscious in analysis, the anima will impose upon him concepts in Weltanschauung which will disgust him, even though he knows that the knowledge he will acquire is essential to him. There is the question as to whether he really is willing to risk his career. But with a woman, it is the sacrifice of the ego planning in love that is the important step. And the story shows how the girl sacrifices that by cutting off her finger to open the glass castle. Glass illustrates a condition of being partially cut off. In a wooden or stone castle, you are completely imprisoned in every way. In a glass one, however, you are mentally free but emotionally cut off. Glass is a non-conductor, which is why it is used for windows. Neither heat nor cold pass through it. It is an isolator, although you can at least see through it. People say in analysis, I see the problem quite clearly, but I do not feel it. They are behind a glass wall. That is being partly cut off, not intellectually, but emotionally. One is imprisoned by the glass wall. The spirit can also be a negative imprisonment, if an emotional experience is intended by the self. Let us take it practically. A man, an intellectual introvert, falls in love with a woman. His anima is projected onto her. The unconscious gives him the experience because it wants to get him into a feeling experience and into life. But at that moment, the man says, but Jungian psychology says that such a thing is only anima projection. So I will go home and do some active imagination about her. What he says is quite alright. It is in accordance with Jungian psychology and sometimes of the highest value. But it is not meant to be applied at this moment. Thus, what would have been the spirit becomes imprisonment and a hindrance. It is paradoxical. The spirit redeems one if one is too emotionally involved, and imprisons one if one does not live enough. A glass castle does not show you how to get into action. You see the situation but cannot do more, for you do not know how. In analysis, you talk the thing over and agree with the analyst and see the situation, but what can you do about it? Sometimes the analyst sees a way out and how to break the glass by making an emotional attack himself, but very often one has no such inspiration and must leave it to fate. Here, breaking through the glass is done by the sacrifice. Nothing cuts a woman off more from inner and outer life than ego plots, for in them is a kind of mechanism which arrests life and stops the process. A woman who goes into analysis in order to become more attractive and be able to hook the man is calculatingly misusing the spirit and shutting the door against anything spontaneous. Her calculation precludes the irrational events of life and imprisons everything. In the house, the girl finds the 7 ravens and a dwarf attending them. He is a kind of servant, but also the owner of the castle where they live. The dwarf is a symbol of the creative power of the unconscious. In German and Grecian mythology, he is the great craftsman. A certain class of Greek dwarves were called the dactyls, the fingers. Dwarves are miners, smiths, jewelers, sculptors, musicians, and so on. They generally belong to the surroundings of the Great Mother and personify creative impulses. That which is plotting, when connected with the ego, turns, when cut off, into creativity. Creativity is the alternative for intriguing and plotting, and women who indulge themselves in this way do not want to cut off the finger of plotting for the creative dwarf, and this gives us the tip as to where the ravens went. They went to a secret, earthly, creative power, which means that all that energy, all that mental vitality which the girl had missed, her brother's, is living in the unconscious with the creative dwarf and must be redeemed. By the symbol of the ring, the ravens become connected with her again, and turn into human beings and return home joyfully with her. Of the 2 stories, this one is the less satisfactory. The girl just goes home with her parents. It is a restitution of the former infantile situation, and the dwarf is left behind. In the 6 swans, the infantile mark remains only as the left wing of the youngest brother. Even in life, however, the process of individuation does not always go on. Sometimes it is only a cure, though at other times there may be a much greater development. Where the process of individuation halts is a just so story.